the discovery that ended Germany's last offensive, December 17th, 1944. 0530, Honsfeld, Belgium. The Tiger tank's engine coughed once, sputtered, and died. SS officer Joachim Peiper slammed his fist against the turret hatch. The metallic clang echoed through the frozen darkness of dawn. Below him, his driver desperately tried to restart the 700-horsepower Maybach engine. Nothing happened. The fuel gauge sat on empty. The driver shouted from his compartment, panic barely contained in his voice. The reserve tank was empty too. Piper climbed down from his command tank. His boots crunched against the frozen Belgian ground as he looked around. All around him stood the most powerful armored force the Wehrmacht had assembled for the Ardennes offensive, Operation Watch on the Rhine. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, nearly 5,000 elite Waffen-SS troops, all of them immobilized by empty fuel tanks. Through the morning mist, Piper saw something ahead, an abandoned American position. Honsfeld, a forward supply depot of the U.S. 99th Infantry Division. The Americans had fled so quickly they left behind burning oil barrel fires, steaming coffee cups, and then Piper saw them. Thousands of olive-green fuel jerry cans. They stood in neat rows, stretching across the depot like an offering from the god of war himself. Piper walked forward slowly, almost reverently. One of his men cracked open a canister and inhaled sharply. The unmistakable smell of high-octane gasoline filled the air. Soldiers began refueling frantically, pouring American fuel into German machines. Piper walked among the stacks, counting. The numbers were staggering. 50,000 gallons, enough fuel to power his entire Kampfgruppe toward the Meuse River. Enough, potentially, to change the course of the offensive. The Americans had left behind more fuel in this single depot than most German panzer divisions had received in the previous 6 months. But as Piper stood there, watching his men refuel, a realization settled over him as heavily as the morning fog. If the Americans could afford to abandon this much fuel, if they could leave behind what Germany would guard with entire divisions, then the war was already over. Germany had not simply miscalculated. Germany had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of its enemy. 6 months earlier, in June 1944, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, had delivered a report that should have ended all German offensive operations immediately. Germany's synthetic fuel production, the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht, was being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. Plants that produced 175,000 tons of fuel in April were producing just 5,000 tons by September. The numbers did not suggest difficulty. They guaranteed defeat. Standing in Honsfeld, surrounded by American fuel, Piper was not witnessing luck. He was witnessing the truth.
The math of defeat. What Joachim Piper did not yet know in Honsfeld was that the fuel he had found was not a miracle. It was a statistical error. 6 months earlier, in June 1944, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, had presented the Führer with a report that should have ended all German offensive operations immediately. Germany was running out of fuel, not gradually, not eventually, but catastrophically. Synthetic fuel plants, Germany's lifeline, were being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. In April 1944, Germany produced 175,000 tons of fuel. By September, that number had collapsed to just 5,000 tons. Hydrogenation plants at Pörlitz, Blechhammer and Brux were operating at less than 10% capacity. Some were completely offline. Others produced fuel so contaminated it damaged engines. The numbers did not describe difficulty, they described inevitability. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, including all synthetic production and the captured Romanian fields at Ploiești, produced just 33 million barrels, less than 2% of American output. The Third Reich was attempting to fight a fully mechanized industrial war with fuel reserves closer to those of the First World War. The imbalance was not hidden, it was documented. German logisticians knew it. Speer knew it. The General Staff knew it. Major Friedrich Zimmer of the Wehrmacht's Logistics Command calculated that Operation Watch on the Rhine would require at least 4.5 million gallons of fuel to reach Antwerp. Hitler allocated 5 million. On paper, it was just enough. In reality, only about half of that fuel ever reached forward units due to transport shortages, Allied air attacks, and destroyed rail infrastructure. From the very beginning, the plan relied on capturing American fuel depots. The offensive was not designed to succeed on German resources alone. It was designed to survive by stealing. Piper's Kampfgruppe was the spearhead of the entire operation, the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point. His orders reflected the reality of scarcity. Tanks were to move one at a time to conserve fuel. Engines were to be shut down during any halt longer than 5 minutes. Fuel depots were to be seized before tactical objectives. Even combat decisions were subordinate to fuel considerations. At the same time, just 20 miles away, Captain James Rose of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion made an entry in his unit log on the morning of December 16, 1944. Received fuel resupply, 8,000 gallons. Third delivery this week, tanks already full. Same hour, same battlefield, different universe. The German artillery barrage that opened the Ardennes offensive consumed more ammunition in 2 hours than the Wehrmacht had allocated for entire campaigns earlier in the war. It looked overwhelming, but it concealed a fatal weakness. German firepower was burning through stockpiles that could not be replaced. American firepower was operating within a system that replenished itself faster than it could be consumed. When Piper's column finally began moving at 7 a.m. on December 16th, it was already behind schedule. The roads marked as highways on German maps were narrow forest tracks, many unpaved, many frozen solid. Traffic jams formed almost immediately as heavy vehicles designed for open terrain struggled through the Ardennes forest. Fuel was burned while standing still. By the time Piper reached Honsfeld at dawn on December 17th, his column had advanced just 20 miles. 40% of its fuel was already gone. At that rate, even with perfect conditions, the offensive would die halfway to its objective. The fuel in Honsfeld was not salvation. It was proof that salvation no longer existed. The road that burned fuel. On the maps used by German planners, the roads through the Ardennes were marked as highways. In reality, they were frozen forest tracks, narrow, twisting, choked with snow and ice, designed for horse carts, not 60-ton tanks. As Piper's column pushed forward on December 16th, traffic jams formed almost immediately. Vehicles intended for the open plains of Eastern Europe struggled to maneuver between trees and steep embankments. Every stop meant engines idling. Every delay burned fuel that could never be replaced. German doctrine emphasized speed and shock, but speed required fuel, and the Ardennes consumed it mercilessly. Within hours, Piper's spearhead encountered its first unexpected resistance at Lanzerath. Not a fortified position, not a battalion. 18 American soldiers, a single U.S. reconnaissance platoon delayed the most powerful armored column of the 6th SS Panzer Army for nearly 10 hours. The firefight itself was insignificant in tactical terms. The delay was catastrophic in logistical ones. While Piper waited, his vehicles sat with engines running in sub-zero temperatures to prevent mechanical failure. Fuel gauges crept downward with every passing minute. By nightfall, the timetable was already broken. The offensive had been planned down to the hour. Every delay multiplied the fuel problem. German calculations assumed continuous forward movement. What they got instead was congestion, friction, and exhaustion. When Piper finally broke through and resumed his advance, he was no longer racing toward the Meuse. He was racing his own fuel consumption. By the time the column reached Honsfeld at dawn on December 17th, it had advanced only 20 miles. Nearly 40% of its allocated fuel was gone. This was before major combat, before air attacks, before counteroffensives. At this rate, even if every bridge remained intact and every road lay open, the advance would stall long before its objective. Honsfeld itself was not supposed to be decisive. In American logistics terms, it was a minor forward depot, a temporary refueling point for the US 99th Infantry Division. In German terms, it was unimaginable wealth. The depot contained tens of thousands of gallons of high-octane American gasoline, stacked in neat pyramids of 5-gallon jerry cans. Some were still warm from recent use. Coffee cups sat half-frozen beside oil barrel fires. The Americans had not destroyed the fuel. They had not needed to. As Piper's men refueled, a strange contrast emerged. German soldiers treated each canister as a treasure. Fuel was poured carefully, measured, guarded. But the very existence of such a depot, left intact, abandoned in haste, revealed something far more unsettling. This was not a strategic reserve, it was disposable. German intelligence officers later discovered shipping documents left behind in the depot. The fuel had been refined in Texas, shipped to New York, transported across the Atlantic, unloaded in England, moved to Normandy, and driven hundreds of miles to Honsfeld. The entire journey had taken less than 6 weeks. For Germany, 6 weeks of fuel production could barely sustain a single offensive thrust. For the United States, it was routine logistics. Piper understood the implication immediately. If the Americans could afford to leave this behind, if this was merely a forward refueling point, then capturing it changed nothing. It only delayed the inevitable. The Ardennes were not stopping the offensive. Fuel mathematics were.